My name is Chris, and this story happened about 2 years ago in September. I was 15 years old and had at the time started a new school. I was there for about 2 weeks and I had yet to make any friends. There was another new student that started. His name was Caleb. He was a bit socially awkward, but we started talking, hanging out together, and soon became friends. We both had something in common in being the new kids at school. I hung out with Caleb at school a few times during the weekends. The more time I spent with this dude, Caleb, the more uncomfortable I became around him. He would always speak about strange or depressing topics. He would ask me things like how I will kill somebody and get away with it. Every weird question he asked me, he would then tell me in great length and detail what he would do in that situation. It was like he thought about this stuff all the time. One weekend I went to Caleb's house for a sleepover. When I arrived at Caleb's house, he was home alone. Caleb never spoke about his mom, and he told me that his dad was always working late and he wouldn't see him until the morning time. So we ordered pizza, played video games, and watched movies until late at night. I remember looking at the time and I saw it was 2:40 a.m. I said I was tired and I told Caleb I wanted to go to sleep. So I went downstairs because I would be sleeping on a fold-out couch and Caleb would be sleeping in his room. It took some time for me to fall asleep because Caleb kept me awake by walking around upstairs and switching the lights on and off. I remember having an awful dream that I was drowning and I felt like I was about to die. I woke up in a panic and Caleb had his hands around my throat. He was shaking me. I sat up coughing and struggling to breathe. After I sat up, Caleb asked if I was alright and told me that he came downstairs to get a glass of water and saw it looked like I was having a nightmare, so he shook me to wake me up. I told Caleb I was fine and I thanked him for waking me up. Caleb went back upstairs. I was a bit shook up from what just happened, so I didn't fall asleep right away. I eventually calmed down and managed to get back to sleep after about an hour. When I woke up in the morning, I saw Caleb sitting on the couch on the other side of the room, staring at me. He said I should leave because his dad would be home soon. It was an odd way to end our sleepover, I remember thinking to myself. I thought about if Caleb's dad even knew I was even staying over. Either way, I didn't feel welcomed anymore, so I did what Caleb said and I left to go home. About 2 days later, someone on Facebook messaged me saying that they saw that I was friends with Caleb, and they told me that Caleb used to go to their school. He didn't warn me to stay away from him. He said Caleb was accused of killing another student at a sleepover, and the case went to court. Caleb was found not guilty due to a lack of motive and evidence, but the school Caleb was at didn't want him there anymore. I wasn't sure if I believed what that random person had told me about Caleb, but I did think about the recent sleepover I had. I thought about if Caleb really was trying to wake me up from a nightmare, or was he trying to kill me in my sleep? Caleb did make me feel uncomfortable at times, but after being told he was accused of killing another student, it kinda made me afraid of him. I decided not to spend so much time with Caleb after that, and only hung out with him in school. About 2 months later, he moved away, and I eventually lost contact with him, until a few years later. I saw something on Facebook about a murder in another town. I saw Caleb's picture and I read about what happened. Caleb managed to get a girlfriend, and one day he went to her house to spend time with her while she was babysitting her brother. While Caleb was there, his girlfriend fell asleep as he played video games with her younger brother. She woke up to a woman screaming. That woman was her mother. Caleb's girlfriend went downstairs, saw her mother on her knees screaming. She then looked over at the game area where her brother and Caleb were. At least she thought Caleb was there. What she saw was horrifying. Her brother was laying on his back. Blood was everywhere. But that wasn't the worst of it. His head was missing and Caleb wasn't anywhere to be found. They immediately called the cops, and Caleb was actually caught roaming the streets with blood all over him, including his mouth. Caleb confessed to killing the little boy, but he also confessed to eating parts of him. One thing that they never found was his head. Caleb doesn't remember. Well, at least that's what he told the police. My name is Corey, and growing up I had a best friend whose name was Joshua. I used to have sleepovers at Joshua's house quite often, and in the warmer months, we would have campouts out in his back garden. What was nice was behind Joshua's back garden was a huge forest where we spent a lot of time exploring and playing. It was Friday and I was with Joshua at his house. His mom said dinner wouldn't be ready for another 45 minutes, so he suggested that we went outside and played with Joshua's new walkie-talkies. So that's what we did until dinner was ready. Later that night, we were in Joshua's treehouse playing board games. His parents had already said goodnight to us. As we were playing board games, I heard a crackling static noise. I asked Joshua what that noise was, and he said it's just a walkie-talkie. He said it's probably Doug. I asked, who the hell is Doug? Joshua told me it was this guy that he met out in the woods, and he seemed really cool. Joshua had given him a walkie-talkie, and they speak sometimes at night. I asked Joshua if Doug went to our school. He said he didn't think Doug even went to school. Joshua turned up the walkie-talkie and replied to Doug. Now, when I first heard Doug's voice, he didn't sound like no kid. He did not sound our age at all. Doug asked if Joshua wanted to go with him to check out his gaming room. I asked Joshua what he meant by gaming room. He told me that Doug keeps asking him to go to his house with him. Joshua told me that Doug doesn't really take no for an answer and usually has to just turn off the walkie-talkie. He replied back to Doug saying he can't go with him because he's in his treehouse and was about to go to sleep. Joshua then turned off the walkie-talkie. We spent the rest of the night trading Yu-Gi-Oh cards, playing games before we went to sleep. I don't know why, but I woke up in the middle of the night. I saw a light shining in the treehouse. I thought Joshua was awake reading comics, but when I looked at him, he was asleep. The light was coming from outside. I looked out the window of the treehouse, and I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest shining a flashlight up in the treehouse. They switched it off when they noticed me, pulled up their pants from around their ankles, and ran back in the forest. I woke Joshua up and I told him someone was outside watching us. Joshua suggested that we go inside the house, and I agreed. The next morning, we told Joshua's parents that we slept inside the house because I saw someone in the forest. Joshua never told his parents about Doug, and I don't think he had to because Joshua told me he never heard anything else from Doug again after that night. Joshua and I both think that Doug was in the forest watching a treehouse that night. We both thought of many different theories of what he was planning to do, and honestly, none of those were actually good. I'm glad he never came up there. I'm Brian. Recently, someone asked me if I believed in the paranormal, or if I've had an experience that I felt was paranormal. I replied saying that I'm not sure if I believed in paranormal or not, but I did have a creepy experience. When I was 9 years old, I had a best friend who lived across the street from me, whose name was Maddie. On Fridays and Saturdays, Maddie and I had this plan where we would stay awake past 11 p.m. That was the time both our parents would usually be asleep. We would look out of each other's windows, and we'll use binoculars and flashlights, and we would shine a light to each other's bedroom window, and that would let us know that we're getting on the PlayStation 3 that night, while our parents were sleeping. If neither of us shined a light by 11:30 p.m., that meant we weren't playing the PlayStation that night. It was a Friday night, and I stayed up until around 11:30, and I didn't get a response from Maddie's flashlight. I wasn't really tired, and I had already switched on my PS3. So I thought I would play for a little bit. As I was on the PlayStation, I noticed Maddie had came online. I sent him a message asking him why he didn't respond with his flashlight. Maddie didn't reply. I got up and I shined my flashlight into his room again. I still didn't get a response. I went back on my PS3 and I saw Maddie had replied. The message just said, "Hello." This didn't seem like Maddie at all. I replied back asking if he wanted to play. Maddie replied saying, "Look at my window." I got my binos up and my flashlight and I looked carefully through Maddie's bedroom window. I felt a cold chill when I saw a black tall figure standing in Maddie's window watching me. I didn't know what was going on. If this was a joke, or was he just trying to frighten me? I didn't want to talk to Maddie anymore that night, or play the PS3, so I switched everything off and I tried to go to sleep. I found it difficult to fall asleep that night. I kept feeling like If I looked out my window, I would see that figure watching me again. The following Sunday, Maddie called me and asked if I wanted to come outside and play. When I was outside, I asked what was going on with him the previous Friday and if he was playing a joke on me with that tall figure. Maddie looked at me confused and asked what I was talking about. I explained to him what happened and what I saw. He said that he didn't know what I was talking about, as he and his parents were away for the past 2 days, and they just got back that morning. I showed Maddie the messages I received from his account that night. After reading the messages, he looked like he believed me. Maddie then told me that sometimes in the night, his PS3 will turn on and off by itself. And there's been times where he was sure that he turned off his PS3 before leaving the house, and when he returned, it was back on again. I don't know if what I saw was paranormal, but it still remains the scariest thing that I've ever seen in my life. Each year, me and one of my closest friends, who we'll call Dane, go down to visit his grandparents at their cabin in a nice, small, peaceful town in the North Georgia mountains. Me, my friend, and his grandpa are all outdoors kind of guys, so we're always looking for something fun for all of us to do around the area. One night, we decided to go on a night hike on a trail not too far from the cabin. Now, this isn't your kind of trail you're probably thinking of. It really is a gravel dirt road, but a lot of hunters, campers, motorbikers, and backpackers use it. We headed out to the trail, and right as we pulled up to the trail, we noticed that an older, beat-up, suspicious-looking black Chevy SUV with 2 middle-aged men in it parked next to the entrance of the trail. Now, even though this is a safe area, drug deals and other kinds of sketchy activity can occur deep in these woods, so we avoided going on that trail. And we decided to head down to another trail about a half a mile down the road. We pulled about 50 or so feet into a trail that was just outside of view from the road. We parked the truck, got out, and started our hike. Our hike was off to a great start until we got a mile in, when we started to hear a dog bark from probably about 300 feet away. We decided to keep going, but the dog just would not stop barking. And we didn't know if the dog was on a leash or not and could come attack us, so we decided to turn around and we headed back. When we were about 1,000 feet away from the truck, we could see a car sitting behind my friend's grandpa's truck running with the headlights on. This instantly made us worried because who would just roll up behind a random truck at 10 at night on an isolated trail? Keep in mind, you would have had to drive on the trail to see where we parked the truck. It was not visible from the road. We stood there for about 5 minutes trying to see if we could see anybody, but since it was so dark and pretty far away, it was hard to see anything. Fortunately for us, there was a pretty large tree next to the trail we were able to stand behind, so there was no way these guys could see us from where they were at. My friend's grandpa took these night vision binoculars out and get a better look, but it was still not much help. We decided just to stand there and wait for them to turn around and leave because there was no chance that we were about to go back and walk next to a random car with potential bad people in it sitting behind our truck. After about 10 minutes of just standing there, to my absolute horror, the car drives around the truck and it starts to head down the trail in our direction. As fast as we could, we climbed up this hill right next to us and hid behind a log that was sitting up on top. A few seconds later, the same beat-up black Chevy SUV we saw outside the other trail we were originally supposed to hike on comes driving down, and it went right by where we were 15 seconds ago. The car had its windows rolled down and started to slow down as it drove past us. Me, my friend, and his grandpa were terrified and our hearts were pounding out of our chests. And we were scared these guys would stop and sit there, or even worse, get out and start looking for us. Fortunately, the car just kept driving and never stopped. As soon as the car was out of sight, we got out of our hiding spot, booked it back to the truck, and got the hell out of there. I know this may not be as scary as some others, but it was definitely pretty frightening for us. We don't know who those guys were and what they wanted. My guess is they had a stash of something deep in that trail and they thought that we found it. And I guess they were looking for us, but we don't know what for. A lot of things could have gone wrong. We could have walked up to that truck just as it pulled in. And what if they got out and looked for us? What if they slashed the tires on the truck? Or what if they turned their headlights off and just sat there waiting for us to come back? My friend and his grandpa actually went back in the daytime a few days later to that exact spot where we were hiding and took some pictures. The first picture is where we were standing, looking at the truck and the car behind it. Off in the distance, you can see our truck parked. That's exactly where we had it. Just off to the left is a hill that we rushed up from the car. The second picture, you can see where our hiding spot was. After my friend and his grandpa went back, they said we were very lucky to have made it. Honestly, we were very lucky to make it up there successfully because it seemed impossible to do it as fast as we did, especially with all the shrubs and thorns in the way. If we got up there just maybe 2 seconds later, we would have been seen. And I can only imagine what could have happened if we didn't make it up that hill and if those guys saw us. Right now, I'm an 18-year-old female. This event occurred when I was 11 or 12 years old. I still remember the day, December 1st. This is what led to my parents and I to have to get an alarm installed. One day, my dad and I were home. I was in the living room watching Drake and Josh's Christmas special. Yeah, I remember exactly what I was watching. My dad was in the shower. It was just a regular casual afternoon until the doorbell rang. I paused the movie because, for me personally, we always lower the volume or pause the film when we have an unexpected guest. I was taught well enough to not open a door for anybody. If it was someone I knew that my parents told in advance, I would have opened the door, but this day, it was an unexpected guest. After I paused the movie, I ran to my room to look out the window to see who was at the door. My bedroom window is literally right next to the front door, so I can easily see who's there. But at the same time, it's easy enough to get caught. So I slightly pulled down the blinds, not giving away my position, and saw 2 black women standing there. After seeing them, I shrugged it off. I was thinking maybe they're promoting or selling something. I walked back to the couch and I waited a few more minutes. While I continued to watch the movie for the next few minutes, my heart dropped at what I saw at the back door. It was the 2 women, just standing there. I sat there frozen and unaware of what to do. Thankfully, my dad just finished showering and was entering the living room at the same time. He yelled, "Hey!" before running after them. Of course, they ran off, but my dad tried his best to capture the 2 women, but he couldn't catch them. A few seconds later, I heard tires screeching, which I assumed was their car. I wasn't entirely sure if it was just the 2 of them alone or if they had someone else in the car waiting for them. Whatever the case may be, we didn't encounter them again. I had no idea what their intentions were in the first place. Were they there to potentially rob us, kill us? Probably not, because I didn't see anything. No weapon, nothing. Anyways, I'm just glad that my dad and I are safe, as well as the household. We told my mom when she got home from work later that night. About a week or 2 later, we had an alarm system installed. The question still roams around my head when I think about this event is, why? Why us? Anyways, I'm glad that all of it was over. And wherever they are, I hope they didn't continue their actions and change their behavior for the better. A week ago, me and my little brother were walking our French bulldog Buster around our block to our mailbox. We live in a suburban neighborhood, so all of the mailboxes are located at a certain area, depending on what street you live on. We also just moved here about a month ago, and our community is brand new, so there are still some houses that are being built, and there's also empty lots here and there. But anyways, let's get to the story. My dad told us to walk our dog, and we went to go get our mail. As we were on our way back, a girl looked to be my age, which I'm a freshman in high school, and 14. She stormed out of her house and came out running and screaming, telling someone named Johnny to stop and leave her alone. She slammed the door and was holding a baby and running to another house. I thought she was playing around, but she was screaming bloody murder. Me and my brother kept looking over our shoulders because it was very off. When we reached our house, we informed our parents about it, and a few minutes later my dad, he came out saying that the cops are here. I immediately knew something went wrong over there. Also, before the cops came, A guy was running to a red Toyota Tacoma and sped out of there before the cops came. Then the fire department came, and so did 2 ambulances. I knew something severe had to happen because I'd say around 7 to 10 cops showed up to the house. Later in the week, we got a knock on our door. I was home alone with my brother. I looked through the peephole and I saw a man dressed as a detective at our front porch. I opened the door, and he asked if I was or anyone else near the house that I had previously mentioned. I told him everything that me and my brother witnessed. Then he told me something that shook me. He said that there had been a report of domestic violence in that house where we saw the girl screaming, holding the baby. She actually was the daughter of an alcoholic. The daughter's mother got into an argument with the father. The daughter and the baby had somehow got involved, which led to the monster hitting both of them. The reason why there were so many cops was due to the fact that the father drove off and he was claimed to be armed. A day later, the police discovered that he had took his own life at a power substation near us. The detective said that he was in the red Toyota Tacoma when he took his own life. Then I realized that was the same man that I saw sprinting to that red Toyota Tacoma. I'm still shocked about this because somebody took their life that I actually saw right before it happened. I hope that girl and that baby are okay because I haven't heard anything about them since.
My stalker ended up being the one person in my life that I thought would never do me any harm. My husband of 7 years. And let me tell you, he made my life absolute torture. I'm going to show you my age a little here by saying that at the time this all occurred, what we might call stalker laws these days just didn't exist in the same way. There wasn't the same sort of access to restraining orders. Women's shelters weren't nearly as common or well-funded as they are now. It wasn't a great time to be a divorcee, and if it wasn't for the fact that I was a state employee, I think I would have just been left to deal with it on my own. In the state this took place, it's a serious offense to harass an employee of the state government, so I basically ended up with state troopers as bodyguards for a while. They were wonderful, and I honestly owe them a lot. They would walk me to and from my car. They would come into the office to check on me at least once a day. The only thing was, they couldn't follow me home. The place I'd be alone with 2 young children who didn't understand why their daddy was so angry. This all started when my ex filed for a divorce. We'd already been separated for a while by the time the papers came, and honestly, I totally checked out of the marriage. It was dysfunctional and abusive, and apart from my children, who I love more than anything in the world, I had wasted 7 years of my life with a violent narcissist who I believe took pleasure in my misery. It was typically pig-headed of him to assume I'd contest the divorce, that I'd be unable to fend for myself, and that somehow I'd want him back. But I didn't. I just signed those papers on the dotted line and mailed them back to the courthouse. If he'd bothered to pay any attention to my life before he'd separated, he'd have known I'd gotten 2 serious promotions in 6 months. One earned and one an opportunity, and I was making only a few grand less than him per year. I didn't want child support or alimony. I just wanted him out of my life. When he found out I wasn't contesting the divorce, that was when everything went to chaos. His pathetic little attempt to intimidate me hadn't worked, and because he couldn't control me anymore, he turned rabid. He would call me at least 30, sometimes 40 times a day, to hiss threats of violence down the line at me. He even called me at work. Then, when I had his number screened, he started calling my boss and lying about my behavior in an attempt to get me fired. He called my coworkers and harassed them. On more than one occasion, he came to my office and was caught letting the air out of my tires or keying my car door. He called my family to threaten them as well, then tried to turn my children against me by playing the victim whenever he had custody. Things just got worse and worse and worse. He had my check garnished by telling the county's office that he was the custodial parent, which was a complete lie. Then, without even bothering to check with me or their school records, they just started deducting half my paycheck for child support. I had to take an entire day off of work that I definitely couldn't afford and drive many miles to straighten out this freaking mess that he'd caused. He also called my pastor to cry on his shoulder after making up a bunch of absolute nonsense about me. He was looking for allies. He was looking to alienate me from all those I cared about, and for a while, it actually kind of worked. It was utterly humiliating, and for a while I couldn't get any more than 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night, and that's if sleep came at all. The final straw came when he broke into my house one night and tortured me for 6 hours, all the while his own 2 children were screaming and crying in the next room. My whole face was so swollen that I was barely recognizable, and after he beat me half to death, he turned out to be so drunk that he actually fell asleep on what had been our marriage bed for 7 long years. Once he passed out, I silently slipped out of bed, then crept downstairs to call the police. He woke up to the sight of a cop spraying mace in his eyes, and God did it feel good to hear him scream. Once they hauled him off to jail on assault charges, the cops took pictures of my face to use as evidence against him in court, and for the first time in a long time, I actually felt safe. He went to jail that night, but nothing stopped him from bailing out just a few days later. Luckily, the cops were nice enough to call me to let me know that he was out, but I was still anxious because he'd left his car at my house, which obviously meant he had to come back to get it. I stayed up all night waiting for him to come and get his car. I didn't want to sleep because I didn't know what he would do next. There was every chance that he'd come at night just to mess with me. He finally came walking up at 1:30 a.m., but instead of starting some kind of confrontation, I honestly never saw him move so fast. He wanted to get out of there quickly, and it was clear he hadn't forgotten how terrible it was to get arrested. Finally, it seemed like his manic, violent behavior was starting to subside. The calls and threats kept coming for months, even though I had a restraining order. And on the advice of my lawyer, I began taping them. This is probably the number one thing that ended up making a difference, so ladies, please, get into the habit of taping phone calls and screenshotting anything from your stalkers. Small digital recorders are fairly cheap these days, and they're just as important as mace or tasers in these situations. Even if mine was a long time ago, I'm glad I had something to record it with. Next, he started driving by my house, and it got so bad that I went to stay with my mom because I was just so frightened and exhausted. I was just about to close her front door when I saw his van drive by, and that accounts for one of the few times where I actually became hysterical. Like I said, I was just worn out, emotionally and physically. I called 911 and told them that my stalker was threatening myself and my elderly mother, but only minutes before they showed up, he left, almost like he had a police scanner in his car or something. I went to stay with a friend that night, and you can bet your butt I took my mom with me. I didn't want him to see my car there and break into the house and hurt my mom. She's a frail widow, and the fact that he might have targeted her too was what hit me so hard. It really felt like no one was safe. One night I went to an outdoor music show with an old friend of mine. She told me that I needed the stress release, and she was dead right about that. And on top of that, it was a family concert, so I could have the kids with me. The way I saw it, if the kids were with me, they were safe as possible. Then just as I was getting relaxed, I looked up and saw his van coming around the corner, and at the same time, I realized I couldn't see my kids. I can barely describe the kind of terror that gripped me in that moment. I spun around on the spot and saw that there were a bunch of kids playing in the grass nearby. I spotted my young son, but my 8-year-old daughter was nowhere to be seen. Naturally, I started calling her name as loud as I could, walking towards where the van was parked to make sure it wasn't my husband. That's when I saw him, drunk again. My daughter came running when she heard his voice, and she was just about to climb into the passenger seat when I caught her. She had no idea how trashed he was, and I think it says a lot that she was used to seeing him like that, how seeing him all red-eyed and slurring his words was like a normal thing for her by that point. I ran to the nearest phone booth, this was way before cell phones, to tell the cops that my ex-husband had just tried to kidnap his own children. I didn't realize how badly I was screaming into the phone because when I looked around, almost everybody at the concert was staring at me. The cops put an APB out on his van, but my nerves were fried, and that night was yet another that came and went without sleep. The next morning, my heroes, the state police, called me to tell me his van was now at his house. I jumped in my car and drove the 60 miles in half the normal time. When I got there, they had his house surrounded. A guy with a bullhorn was saying how they knew he was there because he answered the phone. I had no idea what was going on, but when I asked them and they identified, all they were interested in asking me is if he had a gun. I told them I wasn't sure. He never had one when we lived together, but then again, a lot of things had changed since we were living together. We sat there for like an hour, and no matter how many times the cops called his phone, he just wouldn't pick it up. Finally, the front door opens and a whole bunch of cops are screaming at him to put his hands up as he walked out. The whole time he was just hungover and feeling uncooperative, whereas we were all thinking we might just come out shooting. He gets taken right back to jail, then I drive home again, just emotionally frazzled. He ended up taking a plea bargain and just got probation, but I think the second encounter with the cops actually tipped things over the edge for him. The way he was going, he was either going to end up dead or in jail, and I think that finally got through his thick skull because after that, the harassment started to peter out until at last, I had peace again. Moving me and my kids out of state sure helped, but to my knowledge, he's made no attempt to follow us at all. I'm sorry this comment ended up being so long. I just saw the post and I knew that I had one heck of a story to contribute. Hopefully women and girls can read this and learn a thing or two from my experience and my mistakes so the same thing doesn't happen to them. Because honestly, I wouldn't wish that kind of thing on my worst enemy.